good afternoon to everybody. I think a lot of people know me already, but I'm Donna and I work for EDLAB. And I'm really happy to welcome you all today to this continuing professional development session. With me as well today is Evelina Persson, also from EDLAB, and she'll be helping to moderate the webinar with me. So I don't know if the camera picks everybody up unless the audio's on. So Evelina, if you can just say a quick hello so people
Yeah, hi. Oh, so that's a good one. Yes, hello everyone.
Thank you very much. So today we're going to hear more about the university's new vision on assessment, as well as what we should be thinking about as teaching staff in terms of assessment more generally, so that we can create the best learning experiences for our students, right? And that's because it's well acknowledged that assessment drives learning. So creating meaningful assessment is one of the aims of our new vision, as well as ensuring that our assessment practices are really well aligned to the constructive, collaborative, contextual, and self-directed learning activities that we utilize here at Maastricht University. So to tell us more about that today is Professor Cees van der Vleuten, and many of you know him already, I'm sure. He's chair of the Department of Educational Development and Research at FHML. And scientific director of the School of Health Professions Education. And he's published really widely in the field of evaluation and assessment. Before I hand over to Cees, just to remind the few participants who joined a little bit late, if anyone has any questions at all, place them in the chat and Evelina and I will keep an eye on those as we go along. And then we'll state them in the Q&A on your behalf. And also, if anyone wants their audio or video activating towards the end so that they can ask a question in person, we have the rights to give you those admin rights. So please let us know in the chat. And with that, Cees, we're very happy to hand over to you today.
Okay, thank you, Donna. Let me share my PowerPoint with you. There you go. You should be able to see it right now. Just last week, I received a letter from my faculty director congratulating me with my 40th anniversary of working for Maastricht University. And so I've been here for a long time. And actually, I've been involved in assessment all the time. And basically, I sort of learned and I sort of worked through history. And I see a couple of consistencies that I have called different perspectives, even different paradigms in assessment. And I'll try and sketch these paradigms to learn from the past and to think for the future. These are my three paradigms of assessment, which I will go through: assessment of learning, assessment for learning, and then a systems approach to assessment, looking at the assessment program as a whole. Basically, many of you know this old-fashioned Miller's pyramid, which is a simple model of looking at competence, and which evolves from knowing to doing in real practice. And basically what we've been done in the last many years, last decades, is to climb with this Miller's pyramid with all kinds of methods of assessment. And our toolbox is nowadays really well formed, so we can assess each of these layers in a very competent way. And we've learned some lessons in between. And I'll start with the first paradigm, which is the classical paradigm. That is, it's all related to standardized assessment. So the bottom three layers of Miller's pyramid, where we have the same conditions for all our learners when we do the assessment. The focus is on end of course pass-fail decisions. Basically, you have a course. At the end of the course, you have an assessment. You decide whether someone has passed or failed, and that person will move on if passed, will redo the exam if failed. This is the standard approach to assessment. And there's a big emphasis on making things as objective as possible, as reliable as possible. And the removal of any human judgment is very prominent in this perspective, because everything needs to be very objective. The lessons that we learned from this paradigm is that if we do some quality assurance, like peer reviewing test material, peer reviewing items before test administration, some quality assurance around test development and test scoring has a significant impact on the quality of the exams. Some psychometric analysis after the test administration may have a profound impact on the quality of the assessment. So it is wise to organize such QA procedures around test development and test scoring. They have a lot of impact. Secondly, a very important lesson that we learned quite a lot in a lot of different research, that performance is always contextually bound, and that you have to sample widely across contexts in order to come up with a reliable score. And I'm going to show you some data. The data come from my own, let's say, context, which is health professions education. But if I can express reliability on in a number. If I were to measure your length, and I would do that twice, I would expect a high correlation between the first measure and the second measure. That's reliability. We can express that into a number ranging from 0, no reliability at all, to 1, perfect reliability. And I'll show you a table with different assessment instruments: multiple choice, short essays, a problem-solving test, a subjective oral exam, a long case is an oral exam with a patient. OSCE is objective structured clinical examination, which is a standardized assessment of performance. A mini CEX is a direct observation in actual practice. A video assessment is a video that we run in practice, and we select specific encounters to score them. And finally, fake patients that we sent out to doctors' practices. And these people do not know they're being visited by a simulated patient. The simulated patients are completely instructed to rate the performance of the person being assessed after the encounter. Reliability here is expressed as a function of testing time, which makes it possible to compare across different methods. Basically, what we do is we have a choice of methods ranging from the lower end of Miller's pyramid to the top end. And as you see, quite a lot of testing time is needed. They say that a test with consequences, a summative exam, you need at least a reliability of 0.80. Well, with that criterion in mind, you see you need a lot of testing time, probably 3 to 4 hours of testing time before you can come up with a reliable outcome. And this is all due to the fact that performance is very variable. So even if you have a small change in the context, the scores will be lowly correlated, and therefore you need to sample widely. Yet in other words, most of our tests in actual practice, in educational practice, are not so reliable. Or yet in other words, one measure is no measure. You make a lot of false positive and false negative decisions based on a single measure, simply due to the noise in the measurement. This is bad news, right? You need quite some sampling before you have a reliable outcome. And this has been found in many different domains. Whatever you're measuring it with, you'll find this context problem, and you need to sample very widely. There's also good news in this slide, because you cannot say that the more objective methods are more reliable than the more subjective ones. And that's an interesting observation, because basically what it means is that many subjective judgments provide a pretty robust picture. For example, in this slide, the oral exam is very, very subjective. But if you have many oral exams from many different assessors, you get a pretty robust picture, just as robust as, for example, multiple choices, which are inherently more objective. So yet in other words, many subjective judgments provide a pretty robust picture. An important lesson that we have learned. And then Donna already said it, assessment drives learning. For the learners, the assessment really is the curriculum. They will do anything to prepare themselves in such a way that they will pass. But oftentimes, this preparation is not so positive. And oftentimes, the assessment drives learning in a negative way. If the assessment requires no more than regurgitating knowledge, that's what students will do. So they will do anything to pass the test. If I were to summarize our most dominant assessment approach in actual practice in a caricature, then this would be the caricature. This is our most common approach. Right? So we have a course. At the end of the course, we have an exam. You have to pass for the exam. You move on to the next course. Not sure if you're familiar with the forget curves in psychology, but if you learn something for the occasion itself, 50% will be gone within a few weeks. Right. So in the meantime, all kinds of other developments came about. For example, the rise of competency-based education, meaning that we wish to orientate our learning much more to certain outcomes of education. And I'll describe some of those outcomes in a minute. But competency-based education is basically defining the outcomes of your learning program, and then look at how the curriculum caters those outcomes. Usually the competencies are your longitudinal lines in the curriculum. Also, what happened in the meantime were student-centered learning approaches, or more constructivist curricula. Our own PBL approach would be an example of a more constructivist program than traditional, more teacher-led programs. And this other way of looking at education required a different view on assessment as well. And then finally, really in the last decade or so, we've been introducing a lot of non-standardized assessments, either in school or in the working context, that are based on direct observation. And I'll give you some examples later on. This is all driven by societal needs and by educational insights, like the constructive or the contextual learning that is being done, or the group learning that is being done. There's a lot of educational insights in how to make a transfer to real practice. And I think this has been quite, has a lot of impact on education worldwide. Right, here's a few outcome frameworks from my own domain, which is medicine. And here you see 3 competency frameworks that have been developed in 3 different countries in the world, and there are many more. But what is interesting about these competency frameworks is that they are very similar to each other. it's interesting that they have been developed with a lot of stakeholder input, looking at healthcare for the future. What do we need our education to teach? And it's interesting to then note that most of these competencies are not related to the medical domain at all. They're related to more generic competencies, like being able to communicate, like being able to work in a team, like to act as a professional, and so on and so forth. Quite interesting, because we know from lots of research that when things go wrong in the labor market, these kind of skills are involved, right? We also have good research showing that if you do really well on the labor market, these kind of skills are involved. And we have information that if things go wrong in the labor market, we could already have seen that, predicted that from the performance in school. So basically, these kind of competency frameworks emphasize more generic skills that are relevant to any kind of domain, and which are really relevant for functioning in the labor market. And then finally, we have evidence that if you pay attention to these kind of skills in a curriculum, they will grow, and vice versa. So if you don't pay attention to these kind of skills, they will not grow automatically. So basically, to assess these kind of generic competencies, we need to assess much more with unstandardized assessment through direct observation and through interpretation. It's very difficult to assess professionalism or communication in a very standardized approach. You have to look at communication in an educational practice, or at professionalism in an educational practice or a work context in order to say something about those competencies. And basically, this has been done in my domain with a lot of different instruments, which are non-standardized instruments. The mini CEX is a direct observation of someone in a authentic situation. Right. Now, this then led to the second paradigm of assessment, that is assessment for learning. And here the focus is much more on the use of assessment to promote learning, to optimize learning, using assessment to provide feedback to optimize learning. So giving feedback to the learners is an important factor for this approach to assessment. Assessment becomes part of learning, right? It promotes good learning. To give you a couple of examples, we provide quite a lot of feedback to our students. Here's a chart of an individual student on his progress test scores, and he can log into a system and can find his longitudinal scores in any area. Here's another example of our electronic portfolio that generates feedback to the different competencies, and then you compare your individual score with that of the cohort. A very important function of our electronic portfolio is the generation of all the narrative feedback on an individual learner. So particularly with those generic competencies, qualitative information, narrative information, words are really important. To some extent, what we do in practice is often grade students in assessment, but grades or that kind of quantitative information doesn't tell you much. Grades in itself are the poorest form of feedback you can get. Grades don't tell you why you achieved that grade. So narrative information is pretty important.
Sorry to interrupt you, Cees, but could
Yep.
you tell us what mini CEX is?
It's a direct observation in real practice, right? So in my domain, if I have seen you working with a patient, I will give you feedback right after that, right?
Yeah.
Did I leave that on my? Oh yeah. Oh, sorry. There's the yeah that. So here the source is a mini CEX. So you can filter the narrative feedback by the origin where they were gathered, but you can also sort the narrative feedback by competency. So give me all narrative information in relation to communication, right? We learned, however, how we've done research showing that most of the feedback is ignored by students when they are in a summative assessment regime, right? I have passed the test, so who cares? You know, I only care whether I've passed or failed the test. I don't look at the feedback anymore. Actually, we found that the learners who needed the feedback most ignored the feedback most, which was quite interesting. And then what we have learned from this, let's say, paradigm is that feedback is not a one-directional process. Feedback essentially is a dialogue, hopefully a reflective dialogue in a Socratic way. And we've learned, like I said before, that narrative feedback is really important. So words are really important if you talk about the evaluation of more complex skills. And then certainly what we've learned that if you give feedback in an educational or in a working context, the way the feedback is being given really determines the value. And that is determined on the people who are involved in giving the feedback. Giving feedback is a skill, and that needs to be developed. So staff development, faculty development is highly recommended to improve feedback skills. And then, having worked so long in a PBL context, which emphasizes self-directed learning as a basis for lifelong learning, I have learned that self-directed learning requires a lot of directing. And we often provide that through scaffolding with people talking to other people, like coaching or mentoring. So mentoring really helps to develop self-directed learning and to allow learners to reflect on their feedback and to decide what to do next. So these are some lessons learned from the second paradigm. One of my PhD students from the UK asked himself, can the feedback in the context of high stakes assessment, can that also be formative? And the conclusion was really, he says, the feedback is ignored and we should stop this behavioristic approach of assessment that is based on punishment and rewards. We need a different approach to education. And this preluded, I think, to the third paradigm. And to me, that's a more integrated approach to assessment. And this integrated approach to assessment has a marked example, and that is, it integrates lessons from the first and the second paradigm, and the assessment program as a whole is optimized, not the individual method. And that whole is more than the sum of its parts. And a marked example of this systems integrated approach is programmatic assessment, an approach to assessment that is very specific and tackles the program as a whole. Programmatic assessment has a number of principles, which I'm going to go through to you. First of all, the first principle basically is that we have individual assessment moments. And these individual assessment moments, we call them data points. And these data points are not meant for decision-making, not meant for pass-fail decision-making, because they're simply too unreliable, right? One measure is no measure. So the individual data point, the individual assessment is meant to give feedback, not to take decisions. So in programmatic assessment, we remove the passing and failing from the individual assessment, and we only provide meaningful feedback to the learner. And I gave you some examples of that. Programmatic assessment, there's a mix of methods, because we know that a single measure will not do everything. You need a bunch of different approaches in order to do a good job and to cover, for example, Miller's pyramid. And therefore, you need a mix of methods. You deliberately decide that students have to write over here, defend over there, orally present over there, and so on and so forth. Your choice of method depends really on your educational justification for using that method at that moment in time. Or to put it in more educational terms, to reach constructive alignment maximally. And then finally, you have to take decisions, either progress decisions or final decisions. And then you need more data points, you need more information. So the number of data points that you need will depend on the stakes of the decision. And I'll show you in a summary what is meant by that. In addition, to promote reflection, to promote self-directed learning, there's a constant reflective dialogue with the learner based on the feedback. And we do that in the form of mentoring. And then ultimately, we need to take a high-stake decision. For example, passing through to the next year, for example. And we take those decisions based on a group of experts. It needs to be a professional judgment because the information that is being gathered is both quantitative and qualitative. It's not possible to take an algorithmic mean or something like that, or a statistical parameter to establish the pass or fail point. Given the nature of the data, quantitative and qualitative, you need another professional judgment of that aggregated data. And we do that in the form of committees or a group of experts. To summarize, a single data point is meant for giving feedback, is not meant for taking decisions. No grades are being given. An individual data point is focused on meaningful feedback to the learner. And then intermediate decisions need to be taken. For example, in our case, halfway through the year, we make an intermediate progress decision in which we look at all the data points available so far, and then we focus on what's going on with this particular learner. What is really going well? What needs attention? What needs more remediation? And then finally, high-stake decisions, very high-stake decisions need to be taken. For example, promotion to the next year, which are based on many, many data points. And they are focused on a decision that hopefully does not provide any surprise to the learner because of all of the feedback that has been given in the meantime. Or yet in other words, we see the assessment information as pixels. If you have a single data point, a single assessment, you don't see the picture. So that's not meant for decision-making at all. And once you start adding pixels to the picture, you get the idea of the picture behind it. And if you have sufficient pixels, then you can take a decision. In our case, for example, all 60 ECTS points are given at the end of the year after the very high stake decision. a lot of papers have been written about programmatic assessment, and this last one is the first review paper on programmatic assessment. If you go to my personal homepage, you can find those papers if you wish. Right. Lessons that we learned from this third perspective, third paradigm, is that programmatic assessment only fits if you have a constructivist view on education. If you have a modular-based or discipline-based curriculum without any longitudinal lines in the curriculum, which is purely a system where you do the modules, pass and fail them, then programmatic assessment has no purpose, right? Programmatic assessment has purpose if you have longitudinal lines in your curriculum. And then a true learning culture can be achieved where the focus is on the learning instead of the passing the next test. We also have learned that implementation is pivotal, is really important, because you have to convince quite a lot of people to move towards programmatic assessment. It's not easy to say to individual teachers, you may not pass or fail your students anymore. Your task is to provide information, not to pass or to fail. The focus on feedback is also something that is not easy for people to deal with. So implementation is absolutely pivotal. I'm not even going to discuss this slide. You can look at these different perspectives from many different angles, but I'm not going to explain it. I'm going to finish off. I think that assessment has evolved dramatically over time, and that we have had multiple paradigm shifts, multiple perspectives on how we interpret and look at assessment. And naturally, the big question is, where are you? Where would you like to go? I would like you to reflect on that. And with that, I thank you very much. And I'm happy to address some questions if you have them.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Actually, I think we've had quite a few different questions in the chat. It's difficult to know where to start, but I think one of the questions that's reoccurred towards the end is actually the application to other fields outside of medicine. So, I mean, you ended by saying, where do you want to go? How do you think people from other fields can take this on?
I think that the programmatic assessment is not meant for any domain itself. I think the principles behind them fit to any domain. Actually, there's a national platform of training programs that move towards programmatic assessment. And every year we form classes of programs that move towards programmatic assessment. Last year, there were 20 participants in this group, and this year we had 60 schools in the Netherlands moving towards programmatic assessment. So it's not domain dependent. It's the ideas behind it which count. At the same time, we know that it's a radically different form of looking at assessment itself. So you need it's relatively easy to understand the concept, but then to translate it to your educational system is not an easy step to make. We've learned from quite a few implementations. I have a little book here, which is in Dutch, about, I think, 10 different implementations in higher education in the Netherlands. That programmatic assessment is a concept. It's not a recipe, right? It's not here's a recipe, go and do it. But it's a way of thinking around assessment that requires a different mind shift.
Yeah, I think it would be very interesting for us to contact some of the other institutions that are also experimenting or making the move towards programmatic assessment to get them to share their experiences with us in the future for another event. Can you also comment in your view, Cees, Can you make that link between what you're talking about with programmatic assessment and what you think the new vision on assessment is also trying to achieve?
Well, the new vision on assessment is pointing towards programmatic assessment. Programmatic assessment in itself has a set of rules, right, or a set of principles. And I think you can make the assessment more relevant to learning without adopting programmatic assessment. I just wanted to show you that there's a fully different option, if you wish, if you move towards programmatic assessment. But I think that the vision on assessment strongly resonates with the thoughts of the third paradigm.
Yeah, and I think you made that clear at the start of your presentation as well, when you said this is one example or one method for going in this direction. So I think I'll just clarify for people as well, looking at the questions in the chat. So the new vision that's been outlined, again, as I said at the beginning, it states that our assessment practices should be meaningful to the students, as in they should be stimulating learning. And of course, that's open to interpretation. So you really need to think about what meaningful means for you. Right. Courses and your students should also be assessed to the CCCS methods of learning that we employ, and also needs to be aligned on a program level, because that's also essential that you have this alignment throughout your entire curriculum. So that's right. What we want to achieve. Are there other things that you think we can do within the faculties to go down that route and make improvements to assessment that don't necessarily go, right, we're going to move fully towards programmatic assessment? Well,
naturally, you can think about how to improve feedback within the system. Generally speaking, we have a very reductionist approach to assessment. So we give a piece of education, we have a test, and we grade our learners. That's it. There's hardly information in there, right? And I think that you could think about creating more feedback into the assessment system. I see some questions around costs. If you can't afford having a mentoring system or a coaching system, then don't do that. And see if you can approach reflection in a different way, promoting self-directed studying. Programmatic assessment is not the model that needs to be followed by everyone. You can introduce elements of it without moving towards programmatic assessment entirely. I just wanted you to know that many examples exist of using programmatic assessment in actual educational practice.
Yeah, and I think those feedback elements are the ones that are really essential, because if you want to promote learning and not just studying to the test and memorizing and forgetting, then it has to be about the feedback, helping the learner to improve and make their own improvements. And I think as academic staff, we always think that that's going to be really time consuming. So there's always that dread, if I need to build in more formative assessment moments in my course, then it's going to be more time consuming. But I think then you also have to think more carefully or more cleverly about how you can stimulate students to learn from each other, to self-scaffold. So right. How can you do peer assessment, and how can you do self-assessment as part of learners like generating their own feedback and becoming more feedback seeking, I guess. Talking of which, just a quick promo moment, we do have a CPD workshop coming up on giving effective feedback on the 9th of December. So if anyone's interested, they can still sign up for that. It's another online session. But yeah, I think it's also, I think this the feedback aspect also makes it important, because you're thinking, okay, how can I build in more formative assessment moments? So assessment isn't just, it shouldn't be seen as separate from your education. It's part of the entire, it's like you said, it's a systematic, integrated approach to your education.
Right.
That's something that we also want to move people away from, the fact that they think about their course and the content, and then afterwards they think about how are they going to assess. It should be all part of the same process.
I see a lot of questions.
Yeah, I think we had another question about the narrative tool that you mentioned towards the beginning, and is that something like, how was that developed, and is that something that is easily adapted for other departments to use at this moment in time, or is that something?
Well, I saw a comment from one of the other faculties saying that they use narrative assessment all the time. So I think that's not unique to my domain, and can be done in any sort of domain.
I think there were some questions about what you meant very specifically about narrative feedback as well. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Okay. Assessment is often associated with quantitative information, right? Like grades, because we think grades are more objective, right? But when we talk about certain behaviors, for example, in communication or professionalism within a tutorial group, it's pretty hard to grade that, right? And if you do that, you sort of kill what you're measuring. But if I make a comment on your professionalism in relation to working as a group in a tutorial group, I can give you a couple of good points, and I can give you a couple of points for improvement. So that kind of information is what I'm seeking after, which is narrative feedback, right?
Okay, thank you. As I've been so busy talking, I haven't been busy reading. So I'm going to ask Evelina, have you got things in the chat that you can state at the moment?
Yes, I was actually looking at the Q&A section of the Zoom that we're currently in. And there was one question also on the increasing testing time. We could see a table where we could see if testing time goes up, then reliability is also going up. And the question was also, is this including preparation time? And then no, so it's just the pure testing time.
Pure testing time.
All right.
A follow-up question on that as well about how are you actually measuring reliability?
That's a different workshop.
We'll invite you back.
Yeah, that's a different workshop. I mean, then we need to talk about psychometrics, which is the statistical underpinning of measurement. And I can do that. I'm happy to do so, but not for this particular talk.
All right.
Just believe me for the moment.
Then there was also a question by Jos, also in the Q&A section, on the importance of feedback, especially over the progress decisions. And Jos also talked a little bit about his own experiences, but also asks, what is the best way to integrate such justification into programmatic assessment specifically? So I think then the amount of feedback, for instance, or the ways to provide feedback.
There can hardly be enough feedback, right? If we focus on the learning part, there can hardly be enough. There's nothing more powerful for learning to occur than feedback, right? At the same time, feedback is expensive, right?
Yeah.
And we also know from research that a lot of the feedback is ignored because it's not of high quality.
Okay.
So the lesson also is less is more. Do less feedback in a proper way than a lot of feedback in a shallow way.
And do you have practical tips? Because I know FHML, you have really large student numbers as well, but you do have, you're moving towards this competence-based feedback model where you have coaches for the students, and not all of our departments have the ability to offer so much coaching and mentoring. So one of the questions in the chat is, how do you, I said, just get them to do peer feedback and self-evaluations. But I mean, how do you deal with large cohorts if you don't have this coaching method? Do you have a practical tips for people?
Well, indeed, think of assessment forms that do not require that much faculty time. Like, for example, if you have a particular assignment use your peers to get feedback on it, right? Which can be very powerful, because also that can be an educational moment for your peers as well. So you have to find solutions that that do not always involve more faculty time.
And I think one of the questions relating to this, which actually comes directly from one of our students who's joining us today, was also on, well, if you move towards this, not every assessment has a grade. So what do you do with the culture that surrounds a program that is becoming, programmatically assessed? What do you do with students who, maybe they want to do a talent program, but they need a certain GPA, they want to go on to a master's, and they ask, what grade have you got at the moment? Like, how do you take the rest of the world with you, or how do you cope when the rest of the world isn't?
Well, often this argument is used. If I have to apply to a certain situation, people want to know where I stand, and therefore you have to know your average grade. In practice, this hardly occurs, by the way, but nevertheless, if you want to prove that you're okay, that you're good, then show them the feedback you've received. We have created electronic portfolios that has a lot of rich information. You can demonstrate to your, I don't know, next employer how well you did and how good you are. I think that's more easily possible if you have a widely documented system than if you have a simple grade system.
Yeah, and I think that re-emphasizes the importance of good and effective feedback.
Exactly.
Which I should also...
And grades have a lot of side effects, often unwanted side effects. And you're getting a lot of grade hunting. Please tell me what is relevant for the test, because if it's not relevant for the test, I'm not going to do it. Right. So the best thing you can do for students is to tell them what page they have to learn in order to pass for the test. Well, what kind of learning are we promoting with that kind of an approach, right? So we want to stay away from that, but grades have that effect. And it's logical also. I mean, students simply follow the rules that we set as teachers. And I cannot blame our students for a test-directed approach of their studies. That's the way it works, right? If we as researchers have to provide a number of papers every year, we'll provide a number of papers every year. We just follow the rules. Students do the same. And I think that we as teachers need to be aware that this system of learning is not something that is wishful and that we should try and change.
Hence why we have our new vision now. So I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. And a quick shout out to our UCM students who are also running an event in January, trying to bring people together in a co-creation event to talk about what can we do to promote more learning and feedback So look out for that. We've also, and it relates to this case, there's a question that keeps occurring about quality control, or the role of the board of examiners, especially if you move more to maybe competence-based assessment where it's more personalized. Then how do you ensure that assessment is fair, essentially?
Basically through compensation by the massive information that you get. Basically, paradigm one is to try and make every individual assessment as high quality as possible. That's paradigm one. And as an exam committee, you look at that. And usually it means standardizing everything, right? But that's typically paradigm one thinking. In paradigm three, you have a lot of assessment information. Yes, each individual assessment information will be biased, will not be objective, will not be perfect. But the fact that you gather so much information will eventually lead to a much fairer assessment. And I think that if you really treat individual students as individual students, you are very fair to them. You're much more fair than to say, which I never understood, self-directed learning, problem-based learning, defining your own objectives. But at the end of the educational period, you have to jump to my hope. This is what I wanted you to learn. And to me, that's a constructive misalignment that I have been dealing all my life with, basically, to get around it. And I think that if we want to promote really self-directed learning, we have to adjust our classical approach to assessment.
Maybe in line with this, I picked up on one question in the chat as well about, maybe connected to this, how can we, through programmatic assessment, keep differentiating between students, also in terms of pass fail?
Yeah, we do.
We do.
Yeah, we do. We need to pass or fail, definitely. Actually, I'm not a big believer of selection systems, because preschool admission, look at the reliability coefficients that you saw. Any individual measure, it's going to be very hard to believe in that. But I think that the end of the first year of any training program is the most important point for the decision making, because we know that students who are borderline or keep failing are the students that keep on failing and will cost us a lot of teaching time. So basically, I think that the end of the first year, where you had a whole year to evaluate someone, is the most important decision moment in a training program, in any training program. And yes, also in programmatic assessment, you have to pass or you have to fail. Ultimately, you have to take a decision.
All right. And maybe just following up on that, because I'm also very interested in it. So if you already discussed that you have a master program where you hand out the 60 ECTS as a package
every year.
Afterwards?
It's not only the master program, we have it implemented in different programs.
Okay. So in that sense, do you also notice that students, when they graduate, also have more difficulty applying for programs that do ask for greatness? No, not at all. That's good.
Not at all. I actually have some evidence that the learners become more qualified. Actually, if you pay attention to something in education, it will grow. Yeah. So if you pay attention to self-directed studying, if you pay attention to reflection, that skill will grow, right?
Yeah.
And we have evidence, for example, that if you work in a group like in the PBL format, your group, your team functioning improves as a result of that. Logical, right? So if you pay attention to those kind of skills, they will grow.
Yeah.
Okay, so may I ask you, you've been at Maastricht University since 1982, I believe. So somebody asked in the chat, you already said, you're constantly frustrated with the constructive misalignment that you see around you. And somebody says, well, actually, you're going to be retiring next year, and you've got these frustrations, and you've been here since 1992. So the question is there hope? Can we still do something?
Well, definitely. It always reminds me, here in Maastricht, we're sort of spoiled because we have this PBL approach, right? And PBL is old. I mean, we started it in 1974, right? But if you have a traditional system, and if you wish to move to PBL, that's a gigantic step, right? And it's not easy for schools to adopt a PBL approach. You also have to convince a lot of people. It took us 40 years to disseminate problem-based learning around the world. So educational changes move slowly. And I think moving towards something like programmatic assessment has the same sort of change that is needed as moving a traditional system to a PBL system. And that takes time. Actually, to some extent, I'm worried that I see programmatic assessment in so many places in the Netherlands coming back, because just like PBL, I know that if no one says I'm doing PBL, I have no idea what they're talking about, because PBL has many different manifestations. And probably programmatic assessment will have equally many manifestations.
All right, I think we had another interesting question. We have quite some interesting questions, of course, but in the chat, there was another question that I thought was really interesting related to, I think specifically students providing peer evaluation and feedback to each other. So there was this question that said, there are quite some studies where the perceived grade of a student are not well correlated with their actual grade. So if
That's
students
correct.
cannot assess their own performance well, how can we ask them to grade or provide qualitative feedback to others?
Yeah. First of all, there's a lot of research showing that self-assessment is biased. And but this is always related to a single approach to assessment. What I'm talking about is to develop a reflective skill with your learners over time that you also discuss with someone else. And the coaching has been enormously positive. It has a lot of beneficial effects. It allows you to really start becoming a self-reflective person. Once you can discuss your progression with a trusted person. It also has a lot of effect on your well-being as well. So that aspect is really very powerful.
Then the coach, plays a key role. And
Definitely.
I guess this was another question that was stated in the Q&A. If you're a coach or if you're even, you're an assessor and you're giving feedback to the student, well then, how do you take the subjectivity out of that? Because it's not just about, the bias in the peer assessment, but what about in the assessment that you're getting from your assessor?
You don't get the subjectivity out of it. Any sort of professional judgment is going to be subjective. But remember that many subjective judgments make a pretty robust picture, right? So do assemble many different subjective judgments and aggregate that information.
In your coaching method, so like a student isn't assigned a coach or a mentor for the whole year who then gives them the
Actually,
do they switch?
No, the coach follows you all the way, all the years.
But so then you've always got their perspective, right?
Yeah, but the coach is not judgmental, right? Ultimately, the decision is being taken by someone else, right? Actually, there's a dilemma because the person knowing the student best is the coach. But so the coach would be in the best position to judge. But if the coach becomes your judge, then your relationship between the learner and the coach will change, right? So you need to protect that relationship. And therefore, the decision-making is not done by the coach. The coach is simply there to help you, to support you, to, make the best out of you.
Are there other questions from the audience at the moment?
A little bit more on feedback. I just scrolled through it again, and there was also a question that, for instance, that indeed also again on peer feedback, that it should be constructive. Do you have any advice to help students learn to develop the skill? But I think we also just concluded that it is something that a coach can also help with, and just repeating over time so that it becomes an integrated part of your curriculum.
I think that giving and receiving feedback is also a learning outcome.
Exactly. Yeah.
So by doing it,
Yes.
you practice that learning outcome. And I think we should involve our students in that right from the start.
I also saw a question about content knowledge. So, you know, because most of what we've been talking about is related to development of student skills, which of course are important. But yeah, I mean, like, where does the assessment of content knowledge play a role? Does it still play a role? Is that?
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. Yeah, of course. We're actually designing a new bachelor program in medicine. And there we are going to have item banks available that we will give to the student. So the testing knowledge, right? And but we leave it up to the student. If you think you're able to do this particular part, then self-test yourself. And that's up to you. So definitely knowledge will always be important, whatever you do, and needs to be assessed as well.
Yes, that was a misconception that I had regarding programmatic assessment at first, that we have to abandon all types of knowledge tests and all kinds of things.
Not at
but
all.
that's
Not
indeed, it is one of the data points.
Yes.
It is something that adds to our understanding whether a student is capable enough to make the transition to another year or even graduate.
Yeah.
So it is in that sense supportive.
Yeah, definitely. But we often do nothing more.
Exactly. Yes.
Than knowledge testing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the whole idea of competency-based education is that you look at other outcomes as well.
Yes. Also outcomes that we usually underestimate, for example.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Let me see. Oh, we just got another question in the chat. A question first, again, on this peer feedback, because I think that is sometimes seen as a good way to up the amount of feedback without becoming too demanding for the teaching staff. So is it in that sense true, or there are studies again indicating this, that the more people provide peer feedback, the more robust the feedback becomes?
That is true.
Yeah.
That is absolutely true. But I'm always mindful in any assessment situation that things do not become trivial, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you ask a lot of peers information, then you risk trivialization. So you have to be very careful. I rather have fewer very good feedback moments than I have many of them which are shallow, which are not very rich.
Yeah, because that also relates to another question in the chat on that it can become quite overwhelming for a student to also receive a lot of data, maybe on one assignment specifically, but also just throughout the year.
Well, because, actually, I don't think that the feedback is overwhelming to the students. I actually hardly worry about students. Students are young, they're adaptive, they're bright, and they will learn what we expect them to do. And I'm always when we talk about educational changes, I never worry about the students. They will do whatever that we think they should do, but I worry about teachers. That's my worry. Because as teachers, we have our own individual conceptions of what is good teaching and what is good assessment. And it's not easy to change those conceptions.
No, fair enough. I mean,
yeah.
And also I think in that sense, so for the students, you say, I don't really worry about the students, but do you think that it is good for us to have good expectation management up front? also regarding, like we have with PBL, we're very clear on our website and our communication, open days, that we have this system. Do you think that should also be for this new vision on assessment?
We should. I think you should be transparent to your learners.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's an interesting question in the chat about the role of knowledge in today's time of Google.
Yes.
And the suggestion is, should we not focus more on understanding and application of knowledge? And I fully agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that knowledge is something that factual knowledge is something that comes out of my phone, right? And I think working with your knowledge is a lot more important. So I think that if you design assessments, you have to think about this. COVID was a good situation in that regard, because all of a sudden we had to make open book exams.
Yep.
And if you create open book exams, you have to focus on application. You kind of give away the knowledge. So I think that's very important to do. Do you still see a role of grades?
Yeah.
In my ideal, they disappear completely. If we compare it to a different situation, I've been here at the UM for a long time. I've been involved with research a long time, and I've had many PhD students, right? Now imagine that a PhD student would submit a manuscript to me for a paper. And the only thing that I would return to that individual is a grade. That would be just impossible, right? Because the particular receiving the grade cannot do anything with that grade in terms of what should I do next? How do I change my paper in such a way that it's publishable, right? So my role as a PhD supervisor is to provide constant usable information in order to promote and in order to improve the writing of scientific papers, right? Actually, if I would grade them, it would be degrading to the individual. Why can we do that? Why do we keep on insisting on doing that in education? So in my view, grades should be gone.
Mm-hmm.
It's system one thinking. It's the first paradigm thinking, right? Where we have to rank order everyone as objectively as possible.
Right, yes.
But something that you do use then in order to give feedback to students on their performance, you showed something at the beginning, was it that's like from the e-portfolios where it's like a spider web, right?
Right.
And they have different competencies or different skills that, and then you can give feedback on how well they're doing on each of the domains. And is it the expectation that everybody becomes an all-rounder, or should people be able to specialize? Because it's a question that you often get with the assessment of group work. You stick your students together in a group, and it's really important that they perform well as a group. So should you force students to develop in their areas of weakness, or should you allow the students to work in their strengths area?
If group work is done in a group, then the assessment should be group-based. And I've seen initiatives where group-based assessments have turned into individual assessments, but it's becoming an awkward situation. So I think that the group-based judgments should be group-based. Now, I would be against the curriculum where all the assessment would be group-based, right? But if a group-based assessment is combined with other assessments, I think that's just fine.
And in order to give feedback to students, a rubric something that you then recommend in order to as an instrument for feedback?
The rubrics are fine for feedback. Wonderful. I've even seen implementations where the students themselves develop the rubric before they start engaging in the skill. And then they use the rubric to judge themselves.
Nice. I think that relates to one of the questions we had on how to grade student performance, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Maybe also something that I thought was interesting from the chat was this question on the appreciation of programmatic assessment, especially for students who come from a background like a high school situation where there is also a lot of emphasis on grades. How do students like programmatic assessment?
The students go through a transitioning period because they have to get used to it, but then they really enjoy it. To me, this all resonates with questions I get if we talk about PBL itself. Students are not used to PBL,
yeah, fair enough.
right? Can you then expose them to it? My answer is yes, because students are young, are bright, and they're adaptive. They will understand quickly. And we have evaluations of students in programmatic assessment where they become truly self-directed learners. And that was the whole purpose of the, at least of the PBL program that I worked with.
Yes, and following up on that, I get Yossia says, does this also lead to, well, less exam stress because it's not all summative assessment?
Exactly.
But also lesser anxiety, right? And student well-being is really high on the agenda at the moment.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think something that's also interesting is because you say, you see the similarities with PBL education and people's perceptions of that. And yeah, I think perceptions of learning and actual learning aren't always aligned, right? Because often you hear when students are new to PBL and they have to come up with their own learning goals and they can't just look at the tutor for all of the answers, that discomfort also, and the whole discussion session makes them feel like they haven't learned because they've not been told the answers.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, unless there are any other last minute questions on this session or on the new vision on assessment more generally, then I think we can bring the session to a close. So I really want to say thank you very much for your time today, Cees. It's been a very interesting session. If people want to find out more about the new vision on assessment as well, we will be running more activities in the future. Just to reiterate, because I think it was a question that came up a lot in the chat, was the new vision on assessment does not mean all programs are moving over to fully to 100% a programmatic assessment model with 0 grades. That isn't the idea. This is one way of achieving the goals outlined in the new vision, but the new vision is much broader than that. And I think what's also very important to state at this moment, actually, there are already a lot of best practices taking place across the So we're not expecting people to completely overhaul their education, but we want to engage in these kind of conversations with all of you so that we can inspire each other to create more meaningful and better aligned assessment for all of our students. So this is a great step in the right direction in just getting that conversation started and getting people to think about what they could do differently or what we could do better. So thank you very much, Cees, for your time today. Do you have any closing remarks yourself?
No, I see someone wants the slides. I assume you will distribute the video, and you can have my slides as well if you wish.
Yeah, we'll upload everything once the video has been downloaded and edited as well. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Also, thanks to Evelina for help moderating.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye.